What is going on, everybody? What is going on, the Catch fam? My name is John Dawson, and in today's video we are hopping into our starts and sits for the running back position for week 6 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in and hit that subscribe button if you are new to the channel. It really does help out the channel if you guys hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel. And feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Without further ado, let's hop into today's video. All right, Thursday night football, we've got the Commanders at the Bears. Brian Robinson returned to action in week 5, and he did lead this backfield overall with 9 rushing attempts for 22 rushing yards, no score. So not a good fantasy stat line there, but comparing that to Antonio Gibson, who had 3 rushing attempts for 6 rushing yards, he is still leading the backfield as a whole. Though Gibson saw more receiving work with 3 receptions, and we can't forget about J.D. McKissic, who also had 5 receptions and 7 targets in week 5. So overall, we're looking at a committee backfield for the Washington Commanders, but the reality is that the Chicago Bears have been very bad against the running back position. So listen, at the end of the day, any of these 3 running backs could have a better stat line than the other, but I think when we look at the numbers and the amount of rushing attempts, we do want to roll with Brian Robinson, but he's no more than a flex. For me, McKissic in deeper leagues, as long as it's full PPR, is someone you can consider flexing. And I've got Gibson as a sit, but all it's going to take is for Gibson to find the red zone once, for him to pop on the week. So it's going to be a frustrating backfield at the end of the day. I encourage you guys to sit Brian Robinson last week and sit Gibson just to see how the work was split amongst this backfield. And I'm hoping that against Chicago, we see a more clear-cut RB1 come out of this committee. But at the end of the day, I'm pretty worried we're just going to be looking at a committee. So I would not put any of the Washington Commanders running backs in your lineup as anything more than a flex. Moving on to the Bears, David Montgomery had 18.2 fantasy points in week 5 after missing most of week 3 and missing week 4 completely. And we saw KHALIL Herbert really come back to earth as a backup at the end of the day. And I really do believe that Herbert can always have a solid stat line even if Monty is healthy, but we did not see that in week 5 against one of the worst run defenses in the league, the Minnesota Vikings. So here in week 6, I just don't like risking Herbert in your starting lineups even as a flex. But like I said, he can always pop. He is definitely talented enough. But Montgomery had 12 rushing attempts for 20 rushing yards and a score. He added 4 receptions off 4 targets for 62 receiving yards. So I like Montgomery as a start here against the Commanders in week 6. All right, Ravens at Giants. I've got J.K. Dobbins as a flex. Moved him to a flex last week as well. I really just don't see a consistent pattern emerging for any Ravens running back. So after the big game in week 4, I told you guys I actually wasn't too confident in him repeating that in week 5. He gets the Giants, who are kind of middle of the pack against opposing running backs. And here's the issue, right? If you don't have better options, I think it's okay to flex J.K. Dobbins, but I just don't believe that there's going to be a consistent running back on this team. It's just not how this offense is ran. You've got Lamar Jackson taking too much yardage away, and we just have historically seen a committee approach by the Baltimore Ravens. But I do like this game script slightly more against the Giants than I did against Cincinnati. So overall, I think you can keep Dobbins as a flex, but if you have better options, I would definitely roll with those options. Saquon Barkley continues to be an absolute monster in fantasy football. RB3 going into week 5, and he scored 19.6 fantasy points in full PPR, 70 yards on the ground, a score, and 3 receptions for 36 receiving yards. Saved a lot of your fantasy stat lines by finding the end zone at the end of the game in London against the Packers. So of course, if you own Barkley, you're starting him. There's really no debate to be had here. It doesn't matter if he's facing the 1985 Chicago Bears. If you own Saquon Barkley, he is in your starting lineup. All right, Jaguars at Colts. We got a little bit of a divisional matchup here in the AFC South, and man, oh man, we had a little bit of an AFC South showdown last week between the Texans and the Jaguars, and I was tooting the horn for James Robinson as a must-start player all week, and a majority of the fantasy community, and probably all the fantasy community, was saying James Robinson has to be in your starting lineups against the worst run defense in the league, the Houston Texans. And he had 5.9 fantasy points, 10 rushing attempts for 27 rushing yards, 2 receptions for 12 receiving yards. An absolutely disappointing week in week 5 for James Robinson after a huge down week in week 4 against Philadelphia. So due to that volatility, I'm moving James Robinson to no more than a flex. The Colts are right in the middle of the pack against opposing running backs, and they may even move up on the week after playing pretty well against the Broncos. It's worth noting that Travis Etienne had 14.4 fantasy points, 71 yards on the ground, and 43 receiving yards against the Texans. He looked like the better back in week 5, so keep an eye on Travis Etienne as a possible flex as well, but I do want to see a more consistent pattern emerge out of Etienne before throwing him in our starting lineups. And if you're going to ask, am I worried about James Robinson? I am, right? I'm a little bit worried about the Jaguars as a whole. Trevor Lawrence is starting to kind of come back to earth at the quarterback position. Looks like teams are starting to figure out this offense. Christian Kirk is not playing as well. And with how bad the Colts are overall, I mean, they have a pretty solid defense. So I think if you have better options, you can consider them at the flex position moving into week 6. But man, oh man, I am hoping, praying that James Robinson can turn this thing back up, because I do love watching him play football. All right, we need to watch the Colts running backs throughout the week. There is a chance that Jonathan Taylor is ready to go here in week 6. If Jonathan Taylor is listed as healthy, we're starting Jonathan Taylor. That is the end of the story. Nyheim Hines was ruled out of week 5's matchups with a concussion, and Deion Jackson ended up with 13.1 fantasy points against the Denver Broncos in the worst Thursday night football game in the history of the entire league. But we just need to monitor this backfield throughout the week. Like I said, if JT is good to go, we're starting JT. There's no other discussion. I do think if JT is not good to go, you can consider Deion Jackson or Nyheim Hines. But gosh, I just don't know what we're going to be looking at by the time Sunday rolls around. So for now, the time I'm recording this, it's best just to hold off and monitor the Colts backfield. All right, Patriots at Browns. 2 other of my must-start players in week 5, Rhamondre Stevenson and Damien Harris. Right, Stevenson went absolutely off against an awful Lions run defense. Unfortunately, Damien Harris suffered a hamstring injury and had to exit the game, and he just finished with 2.2 fantasy points. So we need to keep an eye on him throughout the week. It's possible he's good to go in week 6. It's also possible that he's not good to go. I think this is another good game script for the Patriots, who might be rolling with Bailey Zappi at the quarterback position again, and really I think that benefits Stevenson and or Harris. But overall, I mean, Bailey Zappi is doing a good job managing these football games, allowing the run game to do its thing and allowing the Patriots defense to do its thing. So I like Stevenson, who had 19.5 fantasy points in week 5, 161 yards on the ground and 2 receptions, no scores, but he didn't necessarily need them. Still had 19.5 fantasy points. So I like Stevenson again against the Browns, and we need to monitor Damien Harris's health throughout the week. Boy, oh boy, can we talk about Nick Chubb just absolutely tearing up this 2022 fantasy football season. 25.4 fantasy points in week 5, 134 yards on the ground and 2 touchdowns. Listen, I like New England's defense right now. I think they're playing really good football, but I do not care. Nick Chubb is in your starting lineup on a weekly basis. At least 15 points in every matchup this year and more than 20 points in 3 out of the first 5 matchups. He's a top 2 back in fantasy football, dependent on scoring format, and he is in your starting lineups. There's no debate to be had. Kareem Hunt found double-digit fantasy points for the first time since week 1 of the 2022 season against a bad Chargers run defense. 47 yards on the ground and a score. Listen, guys, Kareem Hunt is just a weekly flex option for me. He's going to have weeks like we saw in weeks 2 through 4 where he has no more than 9.4 fantasy points, and he's going to have weeks like week 1 and week 5 where he has 14 to 23 fantasy points. You know, he's all over the place. He's a very volatile play, especially with how well Nick Chubb is playing, but he is still worth flexing if we don't have better options moving into week 6. All right, Bengals at Saints. I'm starting Joe Mixon. He's had double-digit fantasy points in full PPR in every game this year except for week 3. Joe Mixon is just a weekly start for me. He's going to continue to be consistent in my eyes, and I like pieces of this Bengals offense. Though they haven't exactly been performing how they did last year, I still think they're a consistent offense, and we want pieces of that offense in our starting lineup. So I'm good to go with Joe Mixon, still a top 15 back, a safe floor, and a good enough ceiling on a weekly basis to be in your starting lineup. Talking about a safe floor, well, we finally got one out of Alvin Kamara. We finally got a solid fantasy performance out of Kamara, who had no more than 7.6 points in his first 4 games of the year, and he missed 2 out of 4 of those games. Faced the Seattle Seahawks in week 5, a really bad run defense, and finished with 23.4 fantasy points, 103 yards on the ground, and 91 receiving yards through the air off 6 receptions. He did have a fumble, but it didn't end up being a factor. He didn't find the end zone, but at the end of the day, man, Alvin Kamara is back in our starting lineups. He's been downgraded to a flex for me for a few weeks there, but hey, I'm confident at this point after the solid performance that we can have Kamara as a solid RB2 moving into week 6. All right, Buccaneers at Steelers. I'm starting Leonard Fournette, who had 18.4 fantasy points in week 4 and 35.9 in week 5. He is back to finding the red zone, the chemistry between him and Tom Brady through the passing game. Now that Evan and Godwin's are back, has been very relevant. 7 targets in week 4, 11 in week 5. He is back into the top 7 at the running back position in fantasy football. He continues to be a start for us, especially against a Pittsburgh Steelers team that is not playing good football overall. So I love Leonard Fournette here in week 6. Najee Harris, man, downgrading to a sit for me. I know it was a tough game script, a tough matchup overall for the Steelers, going up against arguably the very best team in the National Football League, the Buffalo Bills, in week 5. And here in week 6, you get a Buccaneers team that has a really solid run defense. So unless you absolutely have no other option, I think Najee Harris is being officially downgraded to a sit for me. 7.4 points in week 4, 6.6 points in week 5. You got a Kenny Pickett-led offense. And listen, man, I'm rooting for Kenny Pickett, but the Steelers are going to continue to be in game scripts where they have to throw the football. And if you have to start Najee Harris, you are just crossing your fingers that he finds the red zone, because outside of that, he does not have a safe floor or a consistent ceiling at this point in the 2022 fantasy football season. All right, Niners at Falcons. Jeff Wilson's a very solid start here in week 6. He's had double-digit fantasy performances every week since week 2. He had his best day on the ground against the Carolina Panthers in week 5. 20.2 fantasy points, 120 yards on the ground, and a touchdown. He continues to be a solid play moving into week 6 against the Atlanta Falcons. I think he's one of the better starts on the week. I'm a big fan of Jeff Wilson heading into week 6. Tyler Allgeier had a really tough matchup. We didn't like him last week going up against that Tampa Bay run defense we just talked about, right? And it's not looking much better here against the San Francisco 49ers, who has a defense that is just absolutely balling right now. So it's a tough matchup for Tyler Allgeier. I think we sit him moving in to week 6. All right, Jets at Packers. Man, did these New York Football Jets absolutely take advantage of a game script that saw Teddy Bridgewater go down early for the Miami Dolphins. These 2 running backs ran all over the place. I really liked Breece Hall going into week 5. Really encouraged a lot of you guys to have him at the RB2 position or at the flex position, and he did not disappoint. He's officially a top 10 running back in fantasy football in all scoring formats. 27.7 points in week 5, 97 yards on the ground, a touchdown on the ground, 2 receptions for 100 receiving yards. That is an average of 50 yards per catch. He had a really good game overall on Sunday. And Michael Carter, a player who has been downgraded to sit for me over the past couple weeks, had a really good day too. 17.3 fantasy points, 21 yards on the ground, 2 touchdowns on the ground, and 2 receptions. So I think we keep an eye on Michael Carter and his usage, but I really think the game script overall for the Jets and Dolphins gave him an advantage, and I just don't think he's going to be a consistent factor for the Jets, especially with how much Breece Hall is humming right now at the running back position. So let's sit back and watch Carter coming off of a big game. I don't think he necessarily repeats that performance against the Packers. Aaron Jones is a start for me. He did net you double-digit fantasy points, just barely in week 5 at 10 fantasy points. He had 2 receptions for 17 receiving yards and 63 yards on the ground. So I think that Aaron Jones is the running back to start for the Packers. I like this matchup. I like this game script against the Jets here in week 6. Man, A.J. Dillon's a sit for me, though. He has had single-digit fantasy performances in his last 4 games. We haven't seen that same performance that he had in week 1 since week 1. And, you know, we have to factor in he faced the Minnesota Vikings in week 1, which are an awful run defense. But after facing Chicago, Tampa Bay, New York, and New England, he gets the Jets. It's probably the best matchup he's had since week 1, but I still think it's just way too risky to start A.J. Dillon moving into week 6. All right, Vikings at Dolphins. Man, Dalvin Cook just ate up the Chicago Bears defense in week 5. 26.1 fantasy points, 94 yards on the ground, 2 scores and 2 receptions. His best fantasy performance on the year. He's a top 15 back in fantasy football. You have to start him. We just talked about the Jets running backs tearing up the Dolphins defense. I love Dalvin Cook here in week 6. He is definitely a must-start player if he is on your roster. Raheem Mostert had a monster day. I mean, we just talked about the crazy game script that the Jets and Dolphins had, right? Well, Mostert was probably the Dolphins player who benefited the most from it. He had 18 touches, 113 rushing yards, and a score. He also had 1 reception. Guys, it's been way too difficult to call on a weekly basis. Do you start Chase Edmonds? Do you start Mostert? So I still think you watch both of these running backs to see how they're utilized. But in week 5, Edmonds had 1 touch. He had 2 targets. He had 0.1 fantasy points. So essentially 0 fantasy points, right? Where Mostert was the lead back. And what we have to factor in here is that the Minnesota Vikings are very bad against opposing running backs. So I like Mostert this week as a flex, but keep in mind it's a little bit of a volatile situation between those 2 running backs. So keep an eye on both of them. With how bad this run defense is for the Vikings, I won't be surprised if Edmonds has a decent day as well here in week 6. All right, Panthers at Rams. Yes, the Rams run defense is very good. Yes, Baker Mayfield is going to miss this game. Yes, the Panthers look like an absolute hot mess. But at the end of the day, man, I'm starting Christian McCaffrey because he's still a top 5 running back in fantasy football, and he just can't, the potential ceiling here, you can't afford to lose it. And let's be honest, with Baker Mayfield going down, well, PJ Walker might actually be a positive thing for the Carolina Panthers with how bad Baker's been playing. And at the end of the day, right, they just faced the San Francisco 49ers, one of the best defenses in football right now. CMC still at 23.4 fantasy points, 54 yards on the ground, a score, and 50 total receiving yards off 7 receptions. So I continue to start Christian McCaffrey on a weekly basis. There's no doubt in my mind about it. He is a must start every single week. Darrell Henderson had 7 fantasy points in week 5 against a good Dallas defense. Cam Akers had 3.3 fantasy points against a good Dallas Cowboys defense. I'm sitting both these running backs because there's just no ceiling involved here. There's no reason to start either of these running backs unless you're 110% desperate and you're just going to sit back and cross your fingers one of the 2 falls into the red zone. The end zone. I just don't like either of these starts, even going up against a Panthers team that is really at their wits and just fired their head coach, just fired their defensive coordinator. I'm still not crazy about either of them. Like I said, either of them could score and get a respectable fantasy stat line, but it's just too risky on a weekly basis to start Akers or Henderson. The Cardinals at Seahawks. We need to sit back this week and watch James Conner and the Cardinals backfield over. All right, Darrell Williams is hurt. He's questionable to return in the middle of the game with the knee injuries, questionable to play here in week 6 more than likely. James Conner also hurt in week 5. It looks like he's avoided a serious injury, but he does have a rib injury overall, and we just saw what that did to Alvin Kamara for a few weeks. So we need to sit back and see if James Conner is going to play in this game. If he does, he's a good start. It's a very bad Seahawks run defense. But if Williams and Conner are one of the 2 miss week 6, and I think we are rolling full steam ahead with Eno Benjamin. 14.3 fantasy points in week 5, 25 yards on the ground, a score, 3 receptions for 28 receiving yards. Man, I have a strong feeling that Benjamin's going to be the RB1 in week 6, and I have a strong feeling he's going to have a solid overall week. I mean, the Seahawks are playing good football, man, but defensively they are allowing a lot of points to be given up, and they are allowing for very solid game scripts from a fantasy perspective. So we need to kind of monitor this week who's going to be the RB1 for the Cardinals, but whoever we think it's going to be, we're starting in week 6. Speaking of injured running backs, looks like Rashad Penny is going to unfortunately miss the entire rest of the season. I know we hate to see these injuries, right? But man, if you held on to Kenneth Walker, if you kept him on your bench, it's Kenneth Walker season. Let's frickin' go. I'm starting him against the Arizona Cardinals here in week 6. Like I said, these game scripts for these Seahawks games have been absolutely ridiculous from a fantasy standpoint. 14.8 points in relief of Penny for Walker in week 5, 88 yards on the ground and a touchdown. I think he's a solid start in week 6. If he is available in your league, he is your #1 waiver priority moving into week 6. All right, Bills at Chiefs. Devin Singletary, disappointing week in week 5 against Pittsburgh. But man, I mean, the Bills did not need to run the football. They didn't need to do anything. I mean, this game was over at halftime. Josh Allen had end of game stats by the end of beginning of halftime, I should say. This was not a game where the Bills needed to run the football. Against Kansas City, it's going to be a much more competitive game script overall. So I like Singletary in the flex, but once again, there's not a consistent ceiling for Singletary. So this is really if you don't have better options, and most of you guys probably have better options, but if you're in a double flex league, I think this is a good game script for Devin Singletary, or if you're just absolutely desperate and you don't have any other options, I think Singletary is good to go in week 6. All right, at the time of recording this, the Chiefs and the Raiders have not played their Monday night matchup, but let's say Clyde Edwards-Helaire has a bad game against Las Vegas in week 5, which I don't see happening barring any injuries. Well, that would be his first bad fantasy performance on the year, excuse me. He's had at least 14.9 fantasy points in every game this season, with 2 of his matchups having over 22 fantasy points. So I continue to like Clyde Edwards-Helaire on a weekly basis. He's a top 10 back in fantasy football. I think he's going to have a good night against the Raiders, who have a bye week in week 6. We don't even need to worry about Josh Jacobs, but we do want to continue to keep an eye on Isaiah P and his usage. You know, really his usage has come when the Chiefs are playing ahead and not playing from behind. So he's definitely a player to continue to stash and keep an eye out on, because when he has been getting touches, he does look good. But I think at the end of the day, this is Clyde Edwards-Helaire's backfield for the time being, and he's a start barring any injury tonight moving into week 6. All right, Cowboys at Eagles. Man, the past couple of weeks, Ezekiel Elliott and Tony Pollard have been no more than flexes for me, because it's just too volatile. It's too back and forth. We don't know who's going to perform week to week. In week 5, Zeke had 7.8 fantasy points and Pollard kind of popped off. He had 14.6 fantasy points, 8 rushes, 86 rushing yards, and a touchdown. Week 6, it's a tough matchup against the Philadelphia Eagles. It's going to be really interesting to see these 2 defensive units within the same division square off against each other, and I just don't like either Dallas Cowboys running backs moving into week 6, but there's always a chance one of them could have a solid day and find the end zone, but it's just too risky for me moving into this matchup against the Eagles. On the other hand, Miles Sanders continues to be a weekly start. He had his 2nd worst game of the season in week 5 at 8.4 fantasy points, but he still had 58 yards on the ground and 2 receptions. He just did not find the end zone, but I still like Miles Sanders on a weekly basis. Listen, guys, it's a tough matchup against the Cowboys, so if you have better options, you can roll with them. If you want to downgrade Sanders to a flex, I think that's okay, but at the end of the day, man, this Eagles offense is for real. This Philadelphia Eagles team is for real, and I want pieces of them in my starting lineups on a weekly basis. So for that reason, I'll keep Sanders in my lineup here moving into week 6. All right, Broncos at Chargers. Another week, another primetime game for the Denver Broncos. And listen, this Chargers defense is not good against the running back position. Last week against the Colts in a beautiful primetime game on Thursday Night Football, Melvin Gordon netted 13.3 fantasy points. Mike Boone had 11.5 fantasy points, and Latavius Murray had no fantasy points. So we'll see if Murray gets into the mix. We'll continue to monitor Murray and Boone, but I really am of the belief that Melvin Gordon is the RB1 for the Denver Broncos. So I think he's a solid start. He had 103 total yards in week 5. I think we continue to roll with him against a Chargers defense that played really bad last week against the run and has played poorly on the season. Austin Eckler, on the other hand, is a start on a weekly basis. He is RB1 going into week 5 in full PPR, and he had 35.9 fantasy points against Cleveland in week 5. He continues to be a must start on a weekly basis. 173 yards on the ground, 1 touchdown on the ground, 4 receptions for 26 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. Don't think twice about it. Austin Ekeler is a start even against a very good Denver Broncos defense here in week 6. The ceiling is just too high to consider sitting him. And that'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button if you are new to the channel. It really does help us out here at the channel if you guys hit that subscribe button and hit that like button. Feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening, and remember, you saw it here on The Catch.